We interrupt our programming. This message is transmitted at the request of your teachers. This is the emergency BETScast system. NORAD has detected an inbound Cold War test which is expected to commence in 10 minutes. You have not studied, and it's not looking pretty. Please stand by for 50 important terms, people, and events you will need to know. This is your test.
Hey guys, it's Mr. Betts. Guess we better put 10 minutes on the doomsday clock. Cold War. A Cold War is political hostility between two nations that just stops short of actual open warfare, in this case being the United States and the Soviet Union. The US was democratic and capitalistic, while the USSR used communism, or at least a version of it that included the elimination of private property and the means of production owned by all, but really by the government. Other restrictions and oppressions apply. But Mr. Betts, weren't we all just friends at Yalta when America's FDR and England's Winston Churchill convinced Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union to join World War II and to talk about how the post-war world was going to look? Oh, Mr. Betts, the enemy of my enemy is my friend only as long as that second enemy actually exists. Yes, soon the war had ended and an iron curtain had fallen across Eastern Europe, making Soviet puppet governments out of Czechoslovakia and Poland and East Germany. Yeah, Germany had been split up into different occupation zones with the intention of it being unified, but wait 40 years for that. Containment, or holding back the wave of communism in both militaristic and non-militaristic ways, became the plan. The Truman Doctrine, first seen when President Harry Truman sent money to Greece and Turkey to fight communist forces, meant that the US would fight communism spread worldwide. The Marshall Plan saw massive spending on machinery and supplies and food to Western European countries to help them stay non-communist. Russia was not happy about this and cut off access to democratic West Berlin deep in East Germany. The Berlin airlift saw 10 months of American and British planes flying supplies into West Berlin until Joseph Stalin finally ended the blockade. NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, saw America and the Western democracies unite and pledge to protect each other, especially against the growing communist threat. The Warsaw Pact was the Soviets' version between them and the communist governments of Eastern Europe. But communism wasn't just spreading in Europe. Mao Zedong had led a successful communist revolution in China, forcing the democratic government to flee to Taiwan, and the US would recognize them as the actual government of China all the way up to 1979. Meanwhile, back home, you had the Red Scare, which had everybody looking for communists, actual or otherwise. Loyalty oaths were demanded, the McCarran Act tried to force communists to register with the government, and many ended up on blacklists, or lists of suspected communists. This ruined people's career, especially in the entertainment industry, after hearings conducted by the House Un-American Activities Committee. Senator Joseph McCarthy claimed that there was an extensive communist network in the government with little to no evidence, but people believed him until they realized what a lying, shameless, drunk megalomaniac he was. Still, there were some communist threats. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were convicted and executed for being spies and passing atomic secrets to the Soviets, and this was at the beginning of the arms race, or rush to produce more powerful weapons and more of them. That same year, 1949, the Soviets successfully tested their first atomic bomb, and things got real. Speaking of spies though, spies were and continue to be real. The CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, that's basically our spies, was set up in 1947. Now let's turn the heat up a little on this Cold War. The Korean War was the first real conflict of the Cold War, was essentially a stalemate, and you can learn more about it here. It did help NCS 68 to finally pass, which allowed for a massive military spending, with the thinking being that we needed to be ready for the fight when the fight finally happened. Dwight D. Eisenhower became president. He got troops out of Korea and kept them out of the Hungarian Revolution against communist forces, though he wanted to do more. Nikita Khrushchev was a Soviet leader at the time, and he kind of mocked our support for the Hungarians, saying that we supported them much like a noose supports a hanged man. Dude, you won that one, no need to gloat. Ike and Khrushchev would meet at the Geneva summit, as well as leaders from France and England, in which they talked about maybe easing up on Cold War tensions and competing in other ways, such as a space race. And then the Soviets launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite in space, and America lost its mind. In his farewell address, Ike warned of the military-industrial complex, or the alliance between the military and the people that make the weapons, and the impact that has on politics and policies. Ike, I think you're being a little bit paranoid over here. What? We spend more on military than the next 8 countries combined? John F. Kennedy would be elected president after Eisenhower, a essential part of his campaign being that there was a missile gap and the Soviets were ahead, which they weren't at the time. JFK introduced new plans like flexible response, which had different stages to militarily combat communism. Simply put, let's bulk up conventional troops and special forces and not just go straight for the nukes. But if we had to, we had the nuclear triad covered, meaning that we could deliver nukes using strategic bombers, intercontinental ballistic missiles, and sub-launch ballistic missiles that would have a knockout first strike blow to any nation, though we wouldn't be the only ones that could do this for very long. Cuba, having recently turned communist in a revolution led by Fidel Castro, became very chummy with the Soviets, so much so that the Soviets were building nuclear missile sites there. This caused the Cuban Missile Crisis, because now Soviet nukes were like 300 miles away from mainland America. This was probably the closest we got to all-out nuclear warfare, but cooler heads prevailed and the missiles were withdrawn. This was probably because of mutually assured destruction, meaning that if either the US or the USSR had launched an attack, the other had enough weapons to launch one of their own, and everyone would have died. Nobody wins, so nobody plays. Berlin Wall. Oh yeah, that goes up around West Berlin to stop East Berliners from defecting, and we just kind of had to watch. But we also got to watch Neil Armstrong walk on the moon. Yes, America wins the space race. Meanwhile, decolonization had been happening all around the world after World War II, and while great, many of these new nations were turning communist, and that makes it a Cold War issue. The domino theory said that if one nation fell to communism, all the neighboring nations would as well, and we had to put a stop to it, most famously tried during the Vietnam War, which you can learn about here. By the time Richard Nixon became president in 1968, we were losing the war. It was incredibly unpopular at home, and we would pull out for good in 1973. Détente was a policy aimed at easing Cold War tensions and the idea of bringing opposing nations together and maybe creating more of a balanced relationship. Ping-pong diplomacy started in China when the American and Chinese ping-pong teams started hanging out with each other and resulted in Nixon visiting the country to help normalize relations. He would follow this up with a visit to the Soviet Union and the signing of SALT I, a treaty agreeing to work together and to limit the number of certain kind of nukes that both nations had. Meanwhile, the Cold War would rage on in places like Latin America, which saw nations like Chile and Guatemala turn communist, and the US aid opposition forces to overthrow that, which often resulted in even more oppressive regimes. Sorry, Afghanistan was invaded by the Soviet Union, an invasion that ultimately failed because A, the United States helped the Afghani Mujahideen fighters, and B,
you fell victim to one of the classic blunders. The most famous is never get involved in a land war in Asia.
Ronald Reagan became president in 1980 and went all in on Cold War spending, saying that we were creating a Star Wars anti-missile defense system, which we never really did, but the Soviet Union was going broke trying to keep up. The Iran-Contra affair saw officials and officers during Reagan's administration illegally sell weapons to Iran to help fund anti-communist insurgents in Nicaragua. That was no bueno. Meanwhile, Mikhail Gorbachev became the leader of the Soviet Union and looked to reform the superpower using policies of glasnost and perestroika. Glasnost allowed for open discussion about the country's strengths and weaknesses, and perestroika aimed at economic restructuring and limited free markets. START was signed between Gorbachev and President George H.W. Bush and saw the US and USSR agree to reduce the amount of nuclear weapons they had. Why? Because the Cold War was ending. The revolutions of 1989 saw Eastern European countries like Hungary and Poland and East Germany shake off their communist governments. This eventually led to the fall of the Soviet Union. After many Soviet satellite states called for independence and an attempted coup by old-school conservative Soviets had failed, by December of 1991, Russian President Boris Yeltsin had said that the Soviet Union had ceased to exist. Did I make it? Oh, that was close. Ooh, that was like Cuban Missile Crisis close. But at least we don't have to worry about Russia anymore, right? Anyway, if you're prepping for your A-Push exam, you might want to pick up my A-Push It Real Good t-shirt available at my Redbubble store, linked down in the description. I'm not saying that it'll guarantee you a 5, but I'm not saying it'll guarantee you a 5. Legally, I can't do that, but it looks pretty cool. If you like this video, make sure you click the button that lets me know. Leave a comment down below and make sure you subscribe, because there's a lot to learn, but we're gonna learn it together. Better yet, make sure you hit that notification bell, because sometimes YouTube doesn't like to let my subscribers see my videos unless they've clicked that bell. Be safe, I'll see you next time.